you are a parent of a secondary student, you recently received an email with some information about an incident that occurred with a past student. And I wanted to make sure that you understand that this session this evening will not be focused on that incident. And in fact, we won't be able to talk about any specific incidents that may have occurred over the past time. But what we hope to do is to equip you with some context and some tools to talk with your children about this topic. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Newberry.
You guys are so sweet. All right, I'm gonna stand up because I am a talker with my hands, and if you can't hear me, let me know and I'll grab a microphone, okay? All right, so this is really an honor to be here with you guys tonight. I understand that many of us in this room are parents or administrators, and we are busy, and you should or would typically be spending this time running your kids around to their different things. So I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that you are here today. I don't take that honor lightly, and I hope that I give you some good information that's really useful to you tonight. So I am Amber. I am a trauma-informed yoga therapist, and I specialize in working with survivors of sexual assault. I'm also currently a graduate student at USC. I'm interning in clinical social work at Tri-Lakes Collaborative Counseling in Monument, Colorado, and then I am also a spokesperson for RAIN, which is the Rape, Abuse, Incest National Network. More than that, though, I am a mom. I've lived in the Tri-Lakes area for 11 years, and this is my crew. And this is, in case you're wondering, a 9th grader, an 8th grader, a 7th grader, and a 5th grader. So I'll take just all your thoughts and prayers. That would be great. I really appreciate it. I'm here today because in 2019, I was doing my work as a trauma-informed yoga therapist, and I had a handful of girls who I was seeing from our communities. They went to both of our high schools, and they were coming to me because they had been sexually assaulted by classmates. And they broke my heart. They broke my heart for a lot of reasons. I myself am a survivor of sexual assault from when I was a sophomore in high school. And these girls came to me and they reminded me so much of myself. They didn't have the language to talk about what happened to them. They were full of shame. They came because they were scared to death of not being believed if they told what happened to them. And they were also scared to death of what might happen to them in school if they'd said what happened, right? Like the retaliation of their peers. They were scared, and they were alone, and they didn't know or understand what happened to them. And as I worked with them, a common thread kind of came out. And it was that these girls did not understand consent. They didn't understand why they were so upset about what had happened to them. They were coming to me with issues of anxiety and depression and self-harm and not being able to sleep at night, and they couldn't tell you what had happened to them that was so bad that this was what they were experiencing mentally and emotionally. They didn't understand that their consent had been violated. And the more that we talked, the more I understood that probably their classmates didn't understand that they had violated them either. So it is now my mission to make sure that our young people understand consent, because I want to keep all of our kids safe. I don't want our kids to be in a position where they are scared, where they don't know what to do, when they don't know what happened, when they don't know what the right answer is. I want them to always have a clear picture of what is right and what is wrong. So, here are some statistics I just pulled off of the CDC and the RAIN websites. It shows about us that sexual violence among high school students is definitely on an incline. Forced sex is the steepest incline. And it also shows us our statistics of conviction for sexual assaults. I'm going to go over statistics because I think it's important for us to have a mental clarity and a baseline about why consent is important and why we need to talk about it. 1 in 4 girls will be sexually assaulted before she is 18 years old. That is the girls that are in our schools. Those are the girls that are in our communities. Females ages 16 to 19 are 4 times more likely than the general population to be a victim of rape, attempted rape, or sexual assault. In 2021, the CDC found that teen girls are experiencing more sexual violence right now than they have in the past 10 years. And 1/3 of women who experience sexual assault before the age of 18 will experience it again. And what about our boys? Statistics show that 1 in 6 boys will be sexually assaulted before the age of 18. And for our boys, there's so much more stigma. It is so much more difficult for them to be believed. It is so much more difficult for them to come forward. 28% of teen sexual violence happens within intimate relationships because our kids don't know how to have intimate relationships with one another. And so going both ways, girls and boys, a lot of abuse can happen there.
Amber, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but there's a request for you to use the mic so that they can capture it better on the stream.
Okay. All right. In a recent Harvard study of college-age males, 32% admitted to forcing or coercing sex. But of that 32%, only 13% admitted to rape, meaning that 20% believed that forcing or coercing sex was not rape. That's a big misunderstanding. 35% of teen boys who have committed acts of sexual violence say that they were peer pressured to do so by friends. Consent is also about talking about peer pressure. False reports of sexual assault or rape are on the low end of most victimization crimes. It is between 2 and 10%. Only 7% of reported cases of sexual assault end in conviction because of a lack of evidence. Only 63% of sexual assaults are reported, and that, I believe, is due, in fact, that the 96% of sexual assault victims know their perpetrators. And 20% of high school students have sent nude photos, and I just have that in there because I want to talk about that a little bit later. So what is consent? Consent is an agreement between 2 or more people, and it is always affirmative. When I was growing up, there was this whole campaign that said, hey, no means no, right? And consent is actually a lot more than that. Consent is more yes means yes, because the more we know about the way that human beings work, the more we know that sometimes a person can be too scared to say no. They can be too frozen. They can be too locked up in their own bodies to say the words no. So we have to know that consent is an enthusiastic and an affirmative yes. Consent is unambiguous, meaning that you know if you have consent. If you're not sure, then you do not have consent. And it is conscious, meaning that somebody can only give consent if they are awake and conscious. And it is revocable, so somebody can give consent and then decide that they don't want to do what they had agreed to do, and then the consent has been revoked and you need to stop. There's a great little YouTube video called Consent and Tea. There's a version that has very bad language, and then there's a version that's clean. But it's a really cute little stick figure caricature that talks about consent and compares it to tea, and it is interesting and kind of funny if you want to look at it as an adult and decide if you want to share it with your teen. Teaching our kids about consent is teaching them respect for their own bodies and feelings, and then respect for the bodies and feelings of others. So some ways you can talk about consent with your kids is to say, hey, your body belongs to you. You get to decide what happens to your body. No one should touch you without your permission. Telling someone not to touch you is not rude. Consent means always choosing to respect others' boundaries, and respecting someone's boundaries shows that you care about them, and you can choose what you do and who you spend time with. When I teach about consent, I like to teach about it like a traffic light. right? Red light, yellow light, green light. So let's talk about consent. Red light, yellow light, green light, okay? Red light, well, what does that mean? Stop. You guys are slower than the kids. Okay, red light means stop, right? So if you come to a red light, then you know that you have to stop. So a red light looks like somebody who just says no, right? And if we're talking about consent, we can talk about it in terms of sex or touch, but we can also talk about it in terms of playing dinosaurs, right? I want to play dinosaurs with Lindsay, and I say, Lindsay, do you want to play dinosaurs with me? And she says, no. Then she doesn't want to play dinosaurs with me, and I can't make her play dinosaurs with me. We can talk about it when it comes to who sits next to you at lunch, right? If I come up and I say, hi, Officer Wheat, can I sit next to you for lunch? And he says, no, I'm saving that seat. Then I got a red light, and I need to accept that and sit someplace else. We can talk about it when it comes to holding hands. If I go and try to hold somebody's hand and they wrench their hand away and wipe it on their pants, that doesn't feel good. That hurts my feelings, probably. But that was a clear red light. They said no. The yellow light is where things get a little bit tricky, right? Now, we talked about consent and that it's always affirmative, which means that consent is green light only. So if you get a yellow light, it's not consent. But yellow lights are a little bit harder to look at, right? So if I go to Lindsay and I say, Lindsay, let's play dinosaurs, and she says, let's swing instead. She said no to dinosaurs. I can't be like, no, we're going to play dinosaurs, because she didn't agree to dinosaurs. She agreed to swinging, but she didn't agree to dinosaurs. If we're talking about sitting next to somebody on the bus, if I come up and I sit next to Amber on the bus and she crosses her legs away from me and puts in her ear pod and just looks out the window, she's not interested in having a conversation with me on the bus. She didn't say, don't sit here, but she's saying, don't talk to me. Let's not have a conversation, right? If I go to hold somebody's hand, and instead of holding my hand back, they just leave their hand open. They're not pulling their hand away from me, but they're not interested in holding hands with me. And it is my responsibility to recognize that I've made them uncomfortable and let go of their hand. Part of being a parent and talking about consent is teaching your kids how to deal with rejection. It doesn't feel good if somebody won't let you sit next to them at lunch, and it doesn't feel good to have somebody ignore you on the bus. But those things are less about you than they are about the other person and how the other person is feeling and what's going on in the other person's day and how the other person has been interacted with all day. Maybe I sat next to Amber and she just got some really sad news and she didn't want to cry, so she didn't want to talk to me. That's not about me. That's about her. Maybe I want to play dinosaurs with Lindsay, but she just played dinosaurs, so she just wants to swing, or she just wants to do something else. That's not about me. That's about her and dinosaurs. Maybe I want to hold somebody's hand, but they're embarrassed because their hand is sweaty, so they pull it away and they wipe it on their pants, and that feels bad to me, but it's not about me. And that's what we have to teach our kids when it comes to consent. Somebody who tells you no, or somebody who gives you the body language that says, I am not interested in participating, that's not about you. That's about them and their boundaries and their feelings. And if you care about that person, then you need to care about their boundaries and their feelings. And then you have the green light, and the green light says, what? Go! That's right. And the green light is an enthusiastic yes. So if you have an enthusiastic yes, then that means you can do that. You can go ahead and you can hold hands, or you can sit next to each other on the bus, whatever you like. Oh no, the battery's low. Okay. Okay. So there's no sure way We're going to talk about starting early. Consent shows up in our kids' lives really early, and that's why it's important to talk about it early. Okay? It shows up in their lives when they want to play, when they want to share toys, when they want to share food, when they want to go to play together on the playground. All of those things show up early in their lives, and we can start talking about consent early in their lives. And you don't have to talk about it in terms of sex, and you don't have to talk about it in terms of touch if that makes you uncomfortable. But you can say things like, it's okay if when we go to Grandma's house for Christmas, you don't want to give Uncle Larry a hug and kiss on the lips, right? That's okay. You have the right to not do that. When my kids were little, they used to say that my mom's kisses were spicy. And we were all like, spicy? What? But we just let them not kiss her if they didn't want to. The next thing is that peer pressure also has to do with consent. So teaching our child that consent means to always respect people's boundaries. That means that you let somebody else choose what they're comfortable with and choose what they're comfortable with doing. So if you are with somebody and they want you to jump off the swings and you don't want to jump off the swings because you saw somebody break their elbow jumping off the swings, then you should be respected for not wanting to jump off the swings. And you can use that same conversation when it comes to jumping off the swings, when it comes to vaping, when it comes to drinking, when it comes to sex. You can talk about it in all these arenas. You can talk about consent all the way. And it's important to talk to our kids also about digital consent when they're old enough to have a phone, talking to them about pictures that they might share, talking to them about texts that they might send, letting them know that there is no sure way to have lasting consent for privacy or discretion when it comes to the exchange of photographs and texts. I want to talk to you just a little bit about what it is that we talk about when we talk about maybe somebody being unable to say no or giving a yellow light just with their body language. So we know that as people, we have an autonomic nervous system, right? And our nervous system tells us either you're in rest and digest and everything's lovely, or you're scared for your life and you're in fight or flight, right? And then there is also a part of fight or flight that is freezing. And when you freeze, that is what it looks like to, if you ever see a deer, right? Well, you could see a deer get attacked by a mountain lion in Palmer Lake. Come on over. But you can also see it on the Natural History Channel, right? And you watch an animal get attacked, and you see it being ripped apart. And you're thinking, oh my gosh, but it's not thrashing around, and it's not really fighting. It's just laying there because it's in its freeze mode. It's this beautiful way that our minds just leave our bodies to help us be safe, to help us not feel the pain. So somebody who is in a situation where they are too scared to actually say no, when they're too scared to run away, when they're too scared to fight, they often just leave. They just leave. They check out. And that's why it's important to recognize a body language that says no, a body language that's not actively participating or having fun, a body that is just stiff or limp. That's why that's important to talk about that with your kids. How do we get help for somebody if we know if they've been victimized? Number one is to believe victims and stop our culture of victim shaming. Believing a victim, you have a 90 to 98% chance of being right. And I'll take those odds. We believe our victims, we stop shaming them. We take them to the hospital. If the assault was a rape, taking them to the hospital, if it's been less than 48 hours, can help to collect the evidence that's necessary and get them the treatments that are necessary. If you take them to the hospital, then a police report will be made. If you make a police report will be made. If you talk to a counselor or somebody at the school who's a mandatory reporter, a police report will be made. If a police report is made, it is then up to the victim to decide if they would like to press charges. And so I think that that is a really important thing that we don't talk about as much as we should. But if a police report is made, then the evidence is there, then the text messages are there, then whatever you need to have is been saved and it's in a report, and then you as the victim can decide when and if you ever want to press charges. And when it comes to sexual assault, there is no statute of limitations in Colorado. And then get mental health help. So getting help for your mental health is really important. Being able to get support that you need and the love and the care that you need as soon as an assault has happened is pivotal in changing somebody's life and taking something from being like a capital T, very traumatic event, and making it something that's a more manageable traumatic event in their lives. The sooner we get help, the sooner we can start healing, and the easier it's going to be to go back to school, to be able to focus, to be able to get the sleep you need at night, those kinds of things. So getting help is really important. Consent is about protection. It's about protection for all of our kids. Teaching our kids about consent reduces their chances of victimization. It reduces the chances that they hurt somebody else, and it gives them all the tools they need to help find help if they or someone they know is victimized. Consent conversations need to be ongoing. They need to come from parents and teachers and the community, and we need to let it be known where we all stand. Officer Wheat is here, and he's going to talk to us about the legal ramifications of consent. Consent is in our Colorado state laws, and so it's really important that we understand and know that as well. Thank you so much for your time. I'll be here to answer questions after, and I also have a card if anybody would like more information or wants to know like where I got my statistics from or anything like that. I'm happy to share that with you, okay?
What's going on, folks? So I'm Deputy Chad Wheat with El Paso County Sheriff's Office. I've been a Sheriff's Office for 11 years now. How many of you have students at Lewis Palmer High School? How about Palmer Ridge High School? How about Lewis Palmer Middle School? Right? Okay, good. So one of the biggest things for me, being a school resource officer over the last 3 years, is to bring education to our students, right? I want to give them the opportunity to have education before they make a decision to try to keep them from either victimizing others or becoming a suspect themselves, right? And this can come down to, we're talking about consent, relationships as it relates to unlawful sexual contact, as it relates to sexual assault, and or even talking about vaping, use of drugs, underage drinking and driving, dangerous drugs being fentanyl. So these are all presentations that I have built that I go into the classrooms, whether it be health class or social studies, or not social studies, sorry, study hall, and get an opportunity to get in front of the students. And what I've found is that as I've started to be a school resource officer 3 years ago, I was dealing with some crimes, right? We're dealing with harassment, was dealing with this. And I got the opportunity, and Amber Newberry got introduced to me about wanting to bring this into our schools. I was like, that sounds great, because if we can educate our kiddos on understanding consent, hopefully we can give them the education. When they find themselves one-on-one or exploring a relationship, or they're going into the social media realm of Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, you name it, right? And they're having those conversations, or they're maybe getting proposed to share images of themselves, that they have an understanding of what they're about to do or what could be a consequence for them should they make a choice to go along with such, right? So we ended up putting together this PowerPoint, and I give a lot of credit to this amazing lady right here for what she brings forward with the consent. One thing I want to point out as we start looking at Colorado statute and Colorado revised statute is, yeah, unlawful sexual contact and sex assault. There's also sex assault on a child, but for keeping things simple in this situation, looking at how is this crime or these crimes committed? You'll see any actor who knowingly subjects a victim to any sexual contact commits unlawful sexual contact if. What's sexual contact? It's the touching of the private areas, breast, buttocks, or private area, okay? It can be outside of clothing, it can be inside of clothing, okay? It's touching of that area. As you look at the second bulletin there, the actor knows that the victim does not consent. What concerns do we have there as a law enforcement officer, as a parent? As we start to look into that, if we read that, what do we see? Does anybody have concerns? What would be one, if you're willing to share? How do you prove consent? Thank you. Right? How do you prove it? Right? Do you have one, sir?
Yes, sir. Is it possible for a 13-year-old legally in any way, shape, or form to give consent?
So, as you look at ages, the victim is less than 15 years of age and the actor is at least 4 years older. Our kids are experimenting at young ages, okay? You are culpable of committing a crime at the age of 10, right? That means you could be subject to a law enforcement interview at the age of 10 for committing some of these acts, okay? Can they give consent? I'm gonna say it's circumstance, right? Totality of the circumstance is what every law enforcement case is gonna be evaluated on, okay? How do you determine if there was consent or not? What was said by the female, what was said by the male, what was said by the female, male, right? We're in a different culture nowadays, right? When we're in, so I'm gonna keep it full circle, right? But to understand what is the consent, okay? What does the district attorney's office need to prosecute against the suspect? What does a sheriff's office or a law enforcement officer need to establish for probable cause to effect an arrest of someone, right? And those are important questions when we get down to understanding consent, right? If you're not educated about consent and somebody freezes up and I go to ask a suspect if, what signs were you given? Did you know that they did not consent? No, they didn't stop me. They didn't say no, right? Does that keep it kind of open area? Yeah, it can. What if that's all the information we have? What if there is no text messages, previous messages through Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, all those things, right? In some circumstances, when you get deeper into the investigation, we can get a lot more information, right? We can get and recover messages on a phone, right? We can learn that leading up to it, maybe there was conversation about being friends with benefits, right? Those are things that bring much more of a bigger picture to the investigation for law enforcement. But the biggest thing to point out here is that the actor knows that the victim does not consent. And that's gonna be determined on that situation, whether it's at a park, in a car, on a couch, watching a movie with a friend, right? Those are all circumstances. How many of you go through your kids' phones? How many are on your kids' phones daily, going through their conversations? Not a lot of hands going up, right? I don't do it to my kid either. I have 3. I have a 15, 10, and a 6-year-old, okay? However, I know he's a freshman, experimenting with relationships, right? To protect him, getting in his phone, looking through his messages, right? If I can start to see that there's conversations with, if it's a female, right? I can start to say, hey, what's the context here? You guys are talking about friends with benefits. You want to do this. What are you experimenting with? Do you understand what consent is? Right? These are something that we can start to see warning signs, or hey, maybe my kid's starting to explore sexuality, right? And relationships. And we can start to get involved as parents. So as we go forward, there's going to be a list of elements. This is not inclusive. The statute is long when we talk about unlawful sexual contact, elements of impairment, elements of force. Those are going to be the parts that can increase the consequences from a misdemeanor to a felony level offense. If you come over to sex assault, this includes sexual intrusion or penetration, right? And that's going to be of a private area. That's going to increase it automatically to a class 4 felony. Amber had previously talked about it's a decision of the victim, right? The biggest thing is collecting evidence, okay? There's a short window to get some of this evidence and have SANE exams completed, to have those captured by our detectives, our civilian investigators, and those can be retained for evidence in the future. They can be sent to CBI for processing immediately to work an active investigation, okay? And that is that. Victim rights are also afforded to victims of crimes that involve these investigations. But the biggest piece for that would be the education prior to even putting yourself in this situation. I can tell you, since this class came to be and we presented it to our study halls early this fall, I have yet to take one unlawful sexual contact case or sex assault case this school year. Is that a win? I can tell you, I had a female come up to me after our first pilot of this last year and said, your guys' presentation gave me the power to recognize that my boyfriend was coercing me into a relationship I didn't feel comfortable going into, and I was able to get out of it before I became a victim. Amen?
Where did you do those classes?
Those are in our study hall classes.
We did it
LP,
at
yep.
High School, and then I did one at LPMS for the 7th and 8th graders that did not include anything about sex at all, but we talked about like using people's cell phones and
Seems super valuable. I'd like to see it done at PR.
we would like to too. We are talking to Dr. Frank about it right now.
Good.
We're always working for ways to educate the kiddos, to get them the information before making a choice that can affect them long term, right? Some of these can be sex offender registration crimes, where they follow and track you through your entire life, whether it be quarterly, biannual, annual check-ins, follow-ups where a deputy is knocking on your door and doing that annual checkup, right? It's not something you want to have to experience in a previous or in a future relationship, in a marriage that comes back through, right? So that's part of that. Any other questions related to that, concerns? Anybody?
I guess the whole left side of that is contradictory to the concept that no means no, or an ambiguous stance from the victim means they haven't given consent. So there's just a lot of ambiguity.
With how the state law is written in that sense, to the purpose of what information and understanding consent as an affirmative? Is that what you're looking at?
Yeah.
Right?
Basically, they're saying if the person doesn't say no, they've given consent.
And that's kind of what a prosecuting attorney or a district attorney's office would want to have on a piece of paper, right? That the victim said no, right? And this class right here, if I can paint that picture, I'm glad you brought it to fruition, right? But if we can get our young ones the power to say no, or to give out of that circumstance, like the one female, right? There's been others, but I paint that picture because it was the first time we gave the class, and it was the next day she came out to me, gave me chills across my body.
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that I have obtained core records that say there's a record number of high sexual assault and sexual harassment cases in our school district this year. So I'm assuming, do you handle all of those for LP or no?
As far as law enforcement investigations,
One statement from Rick Brington.
I have what cases I've pulled.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, that's all I got.
So I think we'll just open it up for any general questions if you'd like advice about a specific topic and how to maybe talk about it with your child. If you have any additional questions for either Amber or Chad or Mr. Frampton, we're happy to discuss those at this time.
Yes.
I'd like to ask you about restraining orders. If the court issues a restraining order that may or may not be completely compliant with the age differences or less than 15 years old, does that then have a separate charge if someone goes through that is underage and violates that restraining order issued by a judge in the El Paso County Court?
I guess I'm kind of confused on how you're wording the question. So I would have to see the paper, honestly, on what the restraining order says. When we look at the miscellaneous fields, there's several items that can be in that. So those are situations where that's totally based on each circumstance.
So
It's hard to say without having it in front of me what that would be.
not a yes or no situation. It is circumstantial and situational. Is that what you're saying?
It depends on the circumstances of the case, right? I don't know why they're restrained. Okay, is it mandatory protection order? Is it 100-yard no contact? Is it residential? Is it place of work? Is it school? Those are things that I would have to see in the protection or restraining order issued by the courts, right, to determine if a suspect was in violation of any one of those elements. And then that would be its own separate charge for violating a restraining order. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
I saw a hand over here. Somebody have a hand up? No?
I did.
Oh, okay.
So, again, this is super valuable to me as a parent. Are teachers learning this information and administration?
One thing we thought we would do this evening is we are getting some interest from parents in the community to continue this conversation, as we know we won't address all the complexities of this topic in 1 hour on a Monday evening. So if you are interested in continuing the conversation and what that might look like to bring more of this content into our schools, with our staff, with our students, we'd love for you to leave your name and contact information before you go this evening. And I'll set a sign-up sheet on the table here at the end of our session.
But to answer your question, let me jump in. We have not formally trained our staff in the consent presentation that you've seen today. Most of our staff at Lewis Palmer High School and Lewis Palmer Middle School have had the opportunity to see it as the students were seeing it. And we've done a separate Title IX training for 100% of our staff. And that's part of the onboarding process for those who weren't here at the beginning of the year. We did a full training at the beginning of the year for all of our staff. And that talks about our obligations as staff around mandatory reporting and definitions of what behaviors would lead to an appropriate Title IX investigation.
Okay, that's good. Thanks. I've got a question about social media, people passing around photos. How does consent play into that? Because you can't necessarily control what comes across your phone, and is that prosecutable if somebody were to send you something?
There is one part of the statute that's called unsolicited. So if you receive a nude image unsolicited, as in you didn't ask for it, that would be a situation where that would be one we could pursue with.
And that would fall under the left category that was up there?
Nope, it would fall under 187109, which is, possessing, posting, sending private images.
Right. And I think that, too, it's important to talk to kids when you're talking about nude images, about coercion, right? Because there's a lot of send me a nude photo, 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 send me a nude photo. And then, like, a person just cracks and is like, fine, leave me alone, and does it, and then immediately regrets it, immediately wants to take it back, but they can't, and it's out there. And just the humiliation and the absolute violation that can be to somebody who was coerced or bullied into sending a nude photo, I think is really important to talk about as well. There are situations where people have said, send me a nude photo, or I'm telling everybody that XYZ, or, right? Like, I think it's really important, again, when you talk about the culture of victim shaming, to understand that a nude photo that goes out may or may not have been coerced or manipulated in that way too.
And if that is the case, where something is like done on coercion or based on the realm of intimidation, et cetera, there is an affirmative defense to that built into the statute. So that would be a covering. And one thing I also want to point out too, as we talk about the images, is I obviously see some young ones in the crowd, and if you feel like you're inclined to, if you have a Snapchat account or Facebook account, Instagram account, do you have any friends on your list that you actually physically don't know face to face? And parents can raise your hand to this too. Right? That's the thing. When I teach this class, almost every hand goes up. in that classroom, that they have friends on their friends list that they associate with on their Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook accounts, you name it, whatever that social media platform is, that they associate with or communicate with, not even having met them in person. A lot of times what will transpire from this is somebody baiting them for pictures or getting a nude pic from them or even a picture and then manufacturing a childlike porn image and say, hey, I'm going to send this to 3 of your contacts. You better send me this card right now with this amount of money to this location, right? So they're being extorted for something, okay? And they'll even take they'll send it to 3 of their contacts with who they threatened, right? They'll recall those messages quickly. And a lot of times that this receiver does not get to see that, but they take a screenshot that they did send it, okay, to further coerce the person to give them more of what they want. And a lot of these things that we track back are happening from overseas, these accounts.
That was a good question, though. Thank you. Yeah?
Yes.
So you're the Title IX coordinator for District 38. Do you also handle Monument Academy?
I have at the beginning of the year, but Monument Academy has recently brought on a separate person to do all their Title IX coordination. So I am no longer doing that.
Okay, but you were at the beginning of the year?
I was through December.
Did you training for those teachers as well?
I did not.
Not just
I did do the training. I did a full Title IX training with the administration at the East Campus. So that involved all the secondary administrators, and at the time, Marilyn Holmes, who is the chief operating officer. We did a full training on Title IX with that team at the beginning of the year.
Yes.
Can you tell me, Rick, Summers, or somebody up there, what does mandatory reporting require for staff? What must they report? When are they required to report? When will they not be required to report?
I'll be happy to tackle that one. The mandatory reporting is a relationship we have with Department of Human Services specifically. So the vast majority of our mandatory reporting goes through DHS. However, we're fortunate enough in our high schools to be able to do a report to our law enforcement, our SROs at the high schools, because it's as simple as walking down the hall and making a report to our SROs. We are encouraging and training our staff to make a report at any time they suspect that there's harm done to a child. And it's not our job to investigate what that harm is or to even identify what that harm is. If there's even the slightest suspicion, it's our job to make sure we make that report either to DHS or to the law enforcement agency, and then we let them take on the investigation and make a determination on whether it needs to be pursued further or not.
If it's a Title IX issue, so if we have sexual harassment, inappropriate sexual behavior, in any of those instances, if I went to a counselor as a student and I told the counselor that I was sort of sexually harassed or sexually assaulted by another student, are they required to report that? And who would they report that to? Because under Title IX, my understanding is that doesn't go over to your resource officer. That is handled, of course, would be passed off to you. So then would your counselor then report that to you directly? What would happen?
Yeah, again, it's hard to generalize every circumstance. I can tell you what we've trained them to do, which is if in fact that there's even the slightest indication that that sexual harassment was unwanted and imposed upon them in a non-consensual way, we would involve the SRO or Department of Human Services. That's not ours to determine if it's illegal or a crime at that point. However, when that's not as clear, which in some circumstances it's not, the counselors have been trained to report anything that would be defined as sexual harassment through the laws that we just saw or Title IX to myself as a Title IX coordinator, and then we would make a determination if it reaches the threshold in which we would need to open up a formal Title IX investigation. The three things that we look at when we make that determination is the actions or the behaviors that occurred. The second is the impact of those actions and behaviors on others. And then the third are the extenuating circumstances or the setting. The easiest way for me to talk about what that looks like is if I were to knock over my cup of water, my behavior is spilling the water. The impact could be everything getting wet. And the circumstances and setting could be, well, I accidentally bumped the water. That's a whole lot different than if I take the water and spill it intentionally. The action's exactly the same, the impact is exactly the same, but now the setting and extenuating circumstances are very different. And we would respond in such a way based on all three of those factors on whether it would constitute the need for a formal or informal Title IX investigation. In the process of making that determination, we will oftentimes speak with the victim in that case and assess that impact and work with that family to determine if it meets that threshold as well.
And then are you providing support and resource to the person who's made the claim?
Yes, absolutely. That's part of the Title IX component is we would provide support through mental health within our schools is the primary way that we've done that in the investigations and reports that we've had in schools is we utilize a formal process in which they can access that mental health support through our existing mental health staff. If we ever needed to go outside of the school for that mental health support staff, we have options for that as well.
Do you know how many Title IXs we've had filed in our school district or the claims made since, let's say, August to December versus, January to present? Have we had an increase in Title IX complaints?
An increase, I do know the number of Title IX complaints that have been made, and I can tell you the number, but I can't tell you the number that we've had because it's such a small number that it could possibly betray confidence if someone heard about that. I will not be comfortable reporting numbers if the N size is below 16, which is what the Colorado Department of Education says is the threshold for us to be able to report incidents. So I can tell you that we've had reports. I can tell you that it's less than 16, so I can't give you any specifics to that. And as far as increases, from last year to this year, is that what you're asking?
With Amber's, presentation, you're having kids that are now thinking about what's going on. I'm wondering if some of these presentations are helping students step into that space where they feel safe and able to file a complaint or to let somebody know that something has happened. And so I'm thinking, I don't know when you presented that in fall, I think you said.
Yeah, yes,
I'm just wondering, we're
Yeah.
aware of these things that are, we've had a letter go out. So I'm just wondering if you had any increases with kids and their awareness about this is what could be considered sexual harassment.
I can tell you we've had an increase from last year to this year.
yes.
Number of Title IX reports less than 16, what time frame is that?
This year, I think. is
This
what
year.
he's saying. Yeah.
School year.
School year.
We do have a question that came in from a viewer online for Ms. Newberry. Can you speak to social power differences and impacts on consent, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, and authority figures, etc.?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So when I taught in the schools, we did talk about power differences and power differentials. We talked about how an employee can never consent to a boss, and a student can never consent to a teacher, and an athlete can never consent to their coach because those power differentials make it impossible for consent to be given because the person with all the power holds power over the livelihood of the other person, right? They hold the power of their grades, they hold the power of their playing time, they hold the power of their schedule, their salary, all of those things. So consent can't be given. I would say that somebody who uses coercion, like somebody who is very popular at the school, who's a senior, who maybe goes after a freshman and says something like, well, nobody would believe you, or if you do this for me, then I'll take you to prom, or does like that kind of a social ladder, kind of a coercion, also would not equal consent, right? Because there would be a power differential there. But I do think that that's really circumstantial, right? And there has to be some sort of verbal coercion or manipulation that happens. But it is obviously something that would occur and that would cause like some issue, I think. What do you think?
So for the statute, how it reads in Colorado Revised Statutes, it comes down to age. As I pointed up there earlier, it is anybody under the age of 15 and 4 years, or 16, 17, 10, or 15, 16, 10, sorry. So anybody that's basically 14, 364 down, there's a 4-year age gap for a suspect to be older, and then 15 and 16 years of age, 10-year age gap.
Right, like an 8th grader could not consent to a senior. That would be illegal.
It depends. It's all age range. You can have seniors that are still around that are 19 and 20 at some circumstances, and we could have freshmen at the age of 14. So those are considerations that would be looked at. I saw a hand go up.
Yeah, this is just for the D38 admin present. As far as the consent education at Palmer Ridge High School, is that completely under the discretion of Dr. Frank?
No, I think what's under the discretion of Dr. Frank right now is the logistics. We're in the process of
Okay, because I also have core documents obtained of him saying that he doesn't want to proceed because it's too controversial, and so I just kind of want to know, if there's any checks on that opinion, given what's going on in the community right now, that, does D38 admin have any power to, kind of press for that consent education to happen?
Yes, and I think tonight's one of the first opportunities for us to begin that conversation and initiate this process. One of the things you heard Ms. Whitstein talk about here a little bit earlier is our desire to develop an opportunity to bring a group together to help guide that and drive that, so we do have a more unified, cohesive approach across the entire district. One of the things I really want us to focus on is what does that look like developmentally? So what do we give to our youngest students so it's appropriate and we get this conversation started early? And as they get a little bit older, where is that, you use the example of dinosaurs, I use the example of water. I mean, there's many different ways in which we can engage in this conversation at a developmentally appropriate way. And we are on the front end of really developing that and making that work, including at Palmer Ridge High School.
Thank you. And then I'd also like to inquire about health curriculum. So I know at least I attended Palmer Ridge. There was absolutely no talk about consent in my sex ed class, which is consistent with current students that I've talked to. And I just know our health class was just talked about abstinence, very much didn't talk about consent, the intricacies of teenage relationships, even stuff like sending nudes on social media. None of that was touched on. And I guess I just, as far as making changes to health curriculum, who has the power to do that?
Good question. Teaching about consent is part of our state standards for health at the high school level.
Why are teachers not being held responsible?
I think that's a good question. And as we move forward, again, really wanting input from our parents on what that content might look like moving forward. Yes.
In all transparency, I'm going to step into this space because I've had a conversation with Dr. Summers, and he and I discussed a task force that may be put in place where parents and constituent stakeholders, other individuals might be able to have a conversation about what we're doing currently, what we didn't do well in the past, and I would encourage our district to take a look at our Title IX policies, because where Title IX lies, we
And with that point, I think student voice is going to be essential in that process. So I would like that to extend to our experts in our community, our experts in our school, and our students.
Yes, yeah.
I want to mention that not everyone agrees that this is, well, obviously, if there's more teaching that needs to happen, it needs to happen, and it should happen. But I don't necessarily agree that this belongs in health class. It may belong in a different class, but this is not a health issue. It's an interrelationship issue. It's a safety issue.
Yeah.
I would rather not personally conflate heavy biology with these kinds of interpersonal reactions. So, I mean, go ahead and do the safety thing, but I don't agree that this should have been taught in health class. If it should have been taught, it should have been taught somewhere else.
And I think as you bring that point up,
Right.
part of the rationale for this task force working together is to take the recognition that maybe not all parents are desiring this to be exactly what they want their students to be taught or experiencing. And so does that require an opt-in, opt-out type of a feature? How do we make sure that we have a universal approach that all students receive, but also be thoughtful about where it belongs or how it might happen?
I have no objections. I just have to be about biology and science.
So I think we're agreeing on kind of all the points that we mentioned.
Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to say I'm proud to be in this room and having this conversation. My daughter is 5, so you didn't see my hand being raised about going through her phone. She does not have one. After this conversation,
She'll never have one.
However, I think, thinking back to when I was in high school and when I was in grade school, there was a lot that I didn't know. And there was a lot that was held back from me because I was a child and I wasn't trusted to really have the information so that I can make the right decisions for myself. So I'm proud to be a part of this conversation because I think giving our children the education they need to make the decisions for themselves that they're going to make, and they're all going to fail, but ultimately, part of being a human is failing forward, and the more education you have, the more knowledge you have, the more you're able to fail forward and have success at the end of that. So
Yeah.
I'm really thankful for this, and can't wait to have the consent conversation about dinosaurs and water.
Thank you.
With that, we'll take one more question, and then we are at 7:05, and we're happy to stick around and answer any additional questions afterwards.
Between, I'm more familiar, parallel with UC Health. I'm more familiar with HIPAA than FERPA. And I have heard someone say that because FERPA applies to education, there is some authority or there is some ability to avoid reporting, or at least avoid telling the community of problems. So my question is FERPA requirements enough to conceal from a community problems in Title IX?
FERPA is around educational record for a student, so there are certain things within a student's educational record that are private. A lot of people confuse HIPAA and FERPA, but like if your child had something that came up in the school, or maybe they had a no contact order against them, it wouldn't be something that you could release to the public. That's what protects your child's educational records. If there's something in their educational record, and educational record is, there's a very clear definition of what that is. So if it is captured in an educational record, then it would not be able to be released. So if they maintain it, which is an educational part of the educational record, if the school district maintains it in any way, or somebody who works from, let's say Amber was a school psychologist, and she maintained something, that would be part of the educational record. But that educational record is available to the student and their parent, but not the open public.
And do you confirm that as the school authority on Title IX?
I agree with everything Ms. Augustine just said, yes. And we are very cautious in student records and how anything is released. So there is a high level of confidentiality, and that's a high priority for us.
Even if there's a felony documented in those records?
If there's a student record with any identifiable student information, we will not release it.
Then that conflicts with Colorado Revised Statute 885-105. That is a direct contradiction with what is in that CRS. Done.
Okay. Any other questions?
Thank you all. We are sincere in asking for your support and input moving forward, so I will set our sign-up sheet on the table here. If you are interested in continuing the conversation, we would love for you to be a part of that. Thank you for your time this evening, and thanks to our guest speakers as well. And we're happy to stick around if you have